Imagine going on stage singing your heart out and not realizing the power has gone out until you hit a note and no one hears you. Ronnie DeVoe used that kind of story to describe what it felt like to be in New Edition, thinking the music was reaching everyone, not realizing the system was already working against you. Once New Edition was talked about as pure brotherhood. 5 boys from the Orchard Park housing projects in Boston turning neighborhood talent. Shows into nationwide tours, proof that if you could sing and dance hard enough, you could outrun poverty. But at 57, Ronnie finally starts pulling the curtain back on a different version of that story. He admits that New Edition didn't almost fall apart because of one villain, not even just because of Bobby Brown. It was a chain of buried truths stretching across more than 40 years, contracts signed when they were still poor kids' money that vanished into someone else's pockets, hotel rooms soaked in cocaine and alcohol, fists flying on and off stage, even gunshots echoing behind the curtains where there should have been nothing except music and stage lights. Ronnie says the group was built on forced silence and the constant fear that if they spoke up, the machine around them would destroy them. In this file, we go back through every timeline and every scandal they were told never to mention. We ask what really broke New Edition, who walked away richer, who paid in blood and years, and the question that still chills fans: if Bobby Brown had never spiraled into addiction, would the tragedy have been avoided or simply taken an even more brutal form? Chapter 1. $187 the night New Edition realized they had been sold. The most important night wasn't when gunshots tore through the backstage, or when Bobby and the group ended up fighting in front of thousands. It was quieter than that. It was the night 5 teenagers fresh off a national tour held checks for $187 and finally understood what had been done to them. At the end of 1983, the Candy Girl tour rolled back into Boston during a cold that cut through every layer of clothing. The old tour bus turned toward the Orchard Park housing project in Roxbury, passing the same gray concrete buildings the boys had grown up staring at out of their windows. Just weeks earlier, they had stood under bright lights in New York and Philadelphia, listening to crowds scream their names so loudly it felt like the walls of the arenas were shaking. Now, stepping off the bus, there were no cameras, no flowers, just the raw anticipation of kids about to be paid for the first time after taking their music across America. The payout happened in a small, cramped room behind the housing complex. Fluorescent lights shone straight down, making the place feel more like a cheap office than a celebration. The air smelled like cigarettes, sweat, and winter coats that had been worn too many times. Maurice Starr walked in last, holding a thin stack of envelopes. Right then, Ronnie felt something was off. The envelopes looked too light, too thin for a tour that had sold out rooms and sent Candy Girl up the charts. Maurice began calling names one by one, his voice flat, almost bored. There were no congratulations, no talk of how far they had come. Just names, envelopes, and a quick step away. When he reached Ronnie, he pressed the envelope into his hand and moved on like this was just another errand. Ronnie tore it open, expecting to see a number that proved the dream was real. Inside was a single check, $187. He blinked and checked again. No extra zeros, no decimal misplaced. The amount was exactly what it looked like, $187. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavy. Bobby Brown laughed first, but it was a sharp, empty laugh that didn't match his face. Ricky Bell turned his check over as if more money might be printed on the back. Michael Bivens looked down and didn't say a word. Ronnie stood frozen, a ringing in his ears like the sound had been vacuumed out of the room. Hundreds of hours of practice, long bus rides, nights on stage, until their legs ached, all of it reduced to an amount that couldn't even cover a month of bills. No one slammed a fist on the table. No one flipped chairs. The silence was worse than any shouting could have been. It was the silence of realizing that the adults you trusted had turned you into numbers on a page, and you had no idea how to fight back. Maurice Starr broke the silence with the same cold tone. He said tour costs were high. Studio sessions were expensive. Promotion took money. Everything had to be recouped before they saw real profit. The way he said it, it sounded like simple math, not a betrayal. Mothers standing near the doorway began asking about the trust fund, written into the contract, the one that was supposed to protect the boys' earnings, because they were minors. Maurice had promised that the law would keep their money safe, that a bank account in their name would hold it. But now no one could name the bank. No account number appeared. There was no paperwork to produce on the spot. The trust fund had evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only confusion and the dull ache of being lied to. The shock didn't fade in a week. It stayed with Ronnie. One night, sitting on his bed in the same Orchard Park apartment he'd always lived in, he turned on the radio. Out of the cheap speaker came his own voice, New Edition at #1 on the R&B charts. Outside, record stores were selling their album to kids just like them. In Ronnie's pocket, he had only loose coins. For the first time, he understood that success could hurt just as much as failure. Maurice hadn't robbed them in a simple, obvious way. He had built a trap that looked legal on the surface. Every expense, bus rentals, hotel rooms, stage outfits, was written down as something to be recouped. But as Ronnie later realized, those numbers were always padded, always pushed higher than they should have been. The math never landed in the boys' favor. Even when their songs topped the charts, the accounting books still listed them as unrecouped. To the system, they were a debt, not an asset. Ronnie began to see the truth. This setup wasn't designed to pull them out of the project. It was designed to keep them working like they were still in them. Every new tour, every new album wasn't a step toward freedom. It was another brick in the wall of obligation. Walking away wasn't realistic. Leaving would mean losing their contracts, their careers, and the dream they had finally touched. So the late-night conversations started. Not bold plans to fight the machine, but low, nervous whispers. How could they afford a lawyer when they had barely been paid? If they broke the contract, what else could they do? No one had answers, only fear. They were locked in by documents written in a language they didn't fully understand, and by their own lack of power. Years later, Ronnie would give that memory a name, the $187 night. It wasn't just an insult. It was proof that New Edition had been sold off early, while they still believed they were just kids chasing a dream. Standing in Orchard Park as the dark settled over the buildings again, Ronnie realized that the road ahead was never going to be written only in music and applause. It would be paved with lost resentment and secrets they would have to bury just to stay alive in the system. Chapter 2. Bobby Brown, when drugs turned backstage into a danger zone. From 1985 to 1990, if the $187 check was the moment New Edition realized they had been sold on paper, the years that followed showed them something more frightening. The real danger was no longer just inside contract. It was walking beside them, talking, laughing, and losing control in the same dressing rooms every night. As the lights grew brighter and the tours grew bigger, Bobby Brown didn't just evolve musically. According to people who were there, he changed as a person in ways that made even his closest brothers uneasy. Backstage cocaine, pills, and alcohol did not appear as occasional temptations. They began to show up together like a ritual before and after shows. At first, it was the kind of behavior young stars often get away with late nights, with too much energy, loud laughter, reckless jokes. But the shift came quickly. Ronnie DeVoe and the others began to see that Bobby wasn't just getting high. He was slipping into a state where no one could predict what would happen next. Some nights, right after leaving the stage, Bobby would burst into the dressing room, slam the door so hard the walls shook, and start throwing things. Mirrors, cracked chairs, were kicked over, objects hit the walls and bounced across the narrow hallway. Crew members stood outside exchanging worried looks, careful not to get in the way. It wasn't respect that kept them back, it was fear. Fear that one wild mood swing could land on anyone unlucky enough to be in the wrong place. Ronnie often found himself walking in last, not as a performer, but as the one forced to step into the wreckage. He clearly remembers, according to his own accounts, a night in Los Angeles when Bobby hurled a microphone at a wall because he was convinced the sound mix was off. The mic ricocheted and almost struck a technician in the head. Bobby cursed, shouted threats that if it ever happened again, someone would pay for it. No one filed a report. No one called the label. The incident, like so many others, was swallowed by the same silence that had followed the $187 checks. On stage, Bobby still looked like the very definition of rebellious youth, magnetic, wild, impossible to take your eyes off. But behind the curtains, a different atmosphere took over. Crew members who had been in the business for years began quietly warning each other that Bobby could flip in seconds from joking to violent, from playful to menacing. And when cocaine pills and alcohol mixed, the mood swings were sharper, faster, and more dangerous. Ronnie often stood in the middle of it all. When promoters complained about behavior, when technical staff reported broken equipment or hostile exchanges, Ronnie was the one they called in. He apologized for Bobby, tried to smooth things over, promised management it would not happen again. He begged journalists not to print certain stories. Articles were quietly pulled, interviews softened, not because the reports were false, but because Ronnie and a few others were desperately trying to keep New Edition from collapsing in public. Inside the group, however, everyone knew the truth. By around 1986, Bobby was no longer a minor problem. He was a genuine threat to the stability of the entire operation. Rehearsals were canceled when he didn't show up. Television tapings were delayed as the others sat in dressing rooms, waiting without knowing if he would appear at all. When Bobby finally came in, eyes bloodshot, speech scattered, no one asked direct questions. They just prayed the cameras would roll, the performance would finish, and everyone would walk out without another incident. One particular pattern terrified Ronnie the most. Bobby began focusing his temper on people who had no power to defend themselves, young technicians, new backstage assistant, security staff with no real authority. According to those who witnessed it, Bobby seemed to know exactly who couldn't answer back, who couldn't risk losing their job. That was when his behavior crossed from reckless into a clear abuse of power. Inside closed-door group meetings, tension thickened. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud, but the unspoken question was always there. If Bobby kept going like this, what would happen not just to careers or tour schedules, but to safety? Ronnie understood that one night, one punch thrown too hard, one brawl under the influence, could turn New Edition from a beloved act into a crime scene headline. During that period, Bobby refused to see himself as a problem. As his solo opportunities grew and media attention began to frame him as the wild star, he felt untouchable. Whenever Ronnie tried to speak with him privately, to warn him, to ask him to slow down, Bobby dismissed it. He laughed it off, said people were being dramatic, insisted that everything was under control. But Ronnie saw what fans never saw, the blank look in Bobby's eyes after the high wore off, the rage that appeared with no clear trigger, how aggression stopped being occasional and became routine. Between 1987 and 1990, backstage stories multiplied, shouting matches, damaged rooms, people quitting quietly. Very few of those stories ever leaked outside. Some were kept silent out of fear. Others were buried because no one wanted to be the person who exposed the group. Ronnie and a few others still believed they could make it through this phase if they protected Bobby hard enough and long enough. They thought if they just waited it out, success would stabilize him. What they didn't realize was that their protection was no longer helping him. It was enabling him. Years later, Ronnie would admit a chilling truth: Bobby had become dangerous far earlier than most people ever knew. Not just when fists started flying on stage, not when gunshots echoed backstage years later, but in those cramped rooms where objects shattered, threats were shouted, and everyone present decided their best chance at survival was to keep quiet. That silence, the same habit that had allowed financial exploitation to go unchallenged, became the price New Edition paid again. Because when you protect someone from consequences for too long, you don't just shield them, you put everyone around them in the line of fire. Ronnie understood that better than anyone, standing backstage night after night, listening to the roar of the crowd on one side and the sound of breaking glass on the other, wondering if tonight would be the night the line was finally crossed for good. Chapter 3. Home Again Tour 1996, the night everything spun out of control. If the late 1980s were the years of living with quiet fear around Bobby Brown, the summer of 1996 was when that fear finally burst into the open. It happened not in a backstage hallway or a hotel room, but in front of tens of thousands of paying fans during the Home Again tour, the reunion that was supposed to restore brotherhood and rewrite the story. On posters, Home Again looked like a miracle. All the pieces back together. New edition reborn. But behind the curtain, according to people who were there, it felt less like a reunion and more like a live bomb, slowly ticking down. From the earliest dates on the tour, tension was visible. Bobby Brown repeatedly ignored agreed-upon time limits. His solo segment, set in stone at rehearsals, began stretching longer and longer. It did not feel spontaneous. It felt deliberate. Nights that were supposed to be about New Edition as a whole slowly turned into Bobby Brown showcases. At one of the tour's biggest stops in the American Midwest on September 12, the 1996, the pressure built to a level that could no longer be contained. Nearly an hour before showtime, backstage felt cramped with unease. Ronnie DeVoe stood by the production table, eyes on the set list, taped to the wall. The order had been locked in weeks earlier. In Los Angeles, Bobby would get a 15-minute solo spotlight. Everything else belonged to the reunited group. Ronnie checked the time and looked down the hallway. Bobby's dressing room door was still closed. He had not arrived. About 40 minutes before curtain, Bobby finally appeared. His shirt was hanging open, his eyes red, his voice louder than necessary. With him was a group of men Ronnie barely recognized, unfamiliar faces, with guarded expressions standing close around Bobby like a private security ring. Bobby laughed. Claps shouted that the crowd was about to get a real show tonight. Ronnie stepped in and pulled him aside, speaking low and firm. Time limits. Set order. No surprises. Bobby nodded, but his eyes slid past Ronnie, dull and challenging at the same time. The show began on schedule. The first section with the full group ran smoothly. The crowd surged, singing along to songs that had defined their childhood. Then it was Bobby's solo turn. He stepped out, and the arena exploded. At first, everything matched the plan. One song, loud applause. Ronnie checked his watch. 10 minutes. They were still within bounds. But Bobby didn't stop. He rolled into a second song, then a third. He stretched out the talking breaks, worked the edges of the stage, called out to the city, revisited his solo hits. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Ronnie looked to the promoters and production crew. They began signaling from offstage, giving the visual cues to wrap it up. According to those present, Bobby saw the signals. He turned his head and ignored them. Ronnie moved closer to the wing, gesturing clearly. Bobby glanced over, gave a small smile that didn't reach his eyes, and turned back to the crowd, pushing his energy even higher. For Ronnie, a hot, sinking feeling rose in his chest. It wasn't just anger. It was the realization that they had completely lost control of their own show, live under blinding lights, with thousands watching. At 9:47 p.m., Ronnie made a decision he could no longer delay. He walked out onto the stage. He did not wait for the music to stop. He did not look to management for permission. He went straight toward Bobby, reached for the hand holding the microphone, and pulled. The mic hit the floor with a flat thud that cut through the arena. Bobby spun around instantly. There were no words. He shoved Ronnie hard, nearly knocking them both off balance. Ronnie reacted on instinct and pushed back. Under the white-hot stage lights, the scene twisted in an instant, two men colliding, struggling, not dancing. For a few moments, some in the audience thought it was part of the choreography. Then the music cut out completely. Security rushed in. The illusion shattered. Booing, screaming, and confusion surged from the stands as Ronnie and Bobby were dragged apart and rushed behind the curtains. The show's polished design fell apart in seconds. Backstage was worse. Bobby shouted and cursed, fighting against security grips. Members of his entourage crowded into the narrow space, voices rising, tempers flaring. Equipment racks shook, metal clanged, cases toppled. Ronnie was pulled to the side, his back pressed against stacked gear, heart hammering, trying to figure out where everyone was and who was still safe. Then it happened. Gunshots. Not one, two, then three close together. The sound bounced off concrete walls and metal structures, slicing through the chaos. Ronnie dropped to the ground on instinct. People threw themselves behind cases and through doors. Some hit the floor. Others ran toward exit corridors. In that moment, there were no thoughts of charts, fame, or image. There was only one reality: someone had brought real weapons into their world. A stagehand fell near cable crates. To this day, accounts differ over whether he was hit or just knocked down in the panic. Someone screamed for medical help. Radio calls flew. People said later that it all blurred together: the fear, the shouting, the sense that everything had just gone too far. To the crowd out front, the explanation was quick and shallow. The official announcement talked about technical issues. It insisted there were no serious injuries, no mention of guns, no mention of entourage chaos or near misses that could have left someone dead. The next morning's media coverage barely scratched the surface. No headline declared that New Edition had been one bullet away from tragedy. No one outside the circle truly understood how close they had come. Ronnie sat alone in a small room behind the arena for what felt like forever after things calmed down. His shirt was soaked with sweat. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He stared at the floor, listening to his own breathing, replaying the last 30 minutes in his head. For the first time, he understood that this was not just a story about clashing personalities or a difficult bandmate. It was the end result of years of compromise, cover-ups, and silence. The Home Again tour, sold as a triumphant reunion, had exposed a darker truth. New Edition had drifted so far from its original foundation that they were now operating inside a zone where violence, weapons, and unresolved rage existed just inches away from the music. From that night on, every performance carried a quiet dread that fans never saw. Ronnie knew they had survived by chance, and chance rarely keeps protecting you once you've ignored enough warning signs. The Home Again tour would be remembered not only for nostalgia, but for the night when brotherhood gave way to chaos and the line between show and danger completely disappeared. Chapter 4. Anthony B., the death behind the curtain and a toxic world kept hidden. After the fight and the gunfire during the Home Again tour, New Edition didn't walk back on stage with a renewed sense of unity. They moved forward, wrapped in a fog of suspicion and fear. The tour kept rolling through cities, but the atmosphere behind the scenes changed. By October 1996, as the tour pushed through the eastern and midwestern states, the backstage ecosystem grew more tangled. With each city came new people, local security hangers on so-called friends' faces that no one in the core group fully knew. Ronnie felt that, whatever thin line still separated show business tension from real danger, had been erased. Within that environment, Anthony B. stepped into focus. He was known as a close friend of Bobby Brown, a familiar shadow around him for years. People remembered seeing Anthony in dressing rooms on late-night rides, always nearby when energy was running hottest. To Ronnie, Anthony wasn't the loudest or most flamboyant presence, but he changed the temperature of the room when he walked in. He had a watchful look, a low, controlled way of speaking, and he placed himself close to Bobby whenever things felt tense. At a southern tour stop later that fall, the problems began early in the night. According to those who spoke about it later, arguments broke out behind the stage hours before the show. Technicians complained that members of Bobby's entourage, including Anthony, were standing in restricted areas, blocking equipment routes and ignoring instructions. Voices rose, boundaries blurred. Some said Anthony got into a heated dispute with someone tied to the production over access and control of the backstage area. Others whispered it was about money, bonus payments, side arrangements after the show. There was no official public record spelling out every detail. The only certainty was that the tension in those narrow hallways didn't go away when the lights went up. The show ended close to midnight. Backstage was restless, the air tight and sour. Arguments flared again about who was allowed where and who held real authority. Anthony B. was in the middle of it. A few days later, News began to ripple quietly among tour staff and security teams. Anthony B was dead. There was no major press conference, no widely circulated statement explaining the full circumstances. Details were passed through low conversations between crew members and local contacts. According to those whispers, his death was closely tied to a chain of conflicts surrounding the tour's backstage world fights, grudges, substances, and power plays that had spun too far out of control. Ronnie remembers hearing the news in a hotel room, sitting alone staring through the window at an empty parking lot while a cup of coffee cooled in his hand. No one in the group rushed to ask questions out loud. No one demanded a full accounting. The silence that followed, he later admitted, was not just grief. It was fear. Digging into what happened to Anthony could have meant tearing open a system that had already proven itself capable of violence. It could have meant inviting retaliation or legal chaos. And so instead of answers, there was a wall of quiet. Anthony B was not the first person sucked into that dangerous orbit. But he was, according to those who knew the environment, the first who did not get to walk away from it. Unanswered questions still hover around his story. Was there a larger physical confrontation? Did someone in the extended production ecosystem share responsibility? Did drugs change the night from an argument into something irreversible? No complete investigation was ever laid out for the public. Things stopped at exactly the point where the tour could continue and the New Edition brand could sidestep a major criminal scandal. What haunted Ronnie was not one single detail, but the pattern he could finally see. The entourage had grown too large. Strangers moved through restricted zones unchecked. Drugs were more abundant than bottled water. Power no longer belonged solely to managers or security professionals. It drifted into the hands of whoever was willing to flex their presence through intimidation and fear. In that world, one bad night, one reckless decision, one dose too many was all it took to push someone past the point of no return. In quiet conversations afterward, Ronnie spoke bluntly. This was no longer about image or sales. It was about survival. He believed the combination of entourage culture and unchecked drug use had turned the space around New Edition into something that could literally kill. Anthony B's death to him was not an isolated tragedy. It was the most undeniable evidence of where they had arrived. But changing a moving machine wasn't simple. The Home Again tour still had dates to honor. Contracts still demanded full arenas. So when the lights came up and the crowd screamed, all of that darkness was pushed back out of sight. Anthony B's name slowly faded from public mention. Not because he didn't matter, but because saying his name out loud meant admitting how far things had spun out of control. Years later, Ronnie would talk about him not as a rumor, but as the inevitable outcome of a world neglected too long, a world where money, power, and drugs mixed freely, where no one claimed final responsibility, and where a life could be lost without the full story ever being told. From that death onward, Ronnie understood that New Edition had crossed a line. When the most dangerous thing backstage was no longer sound equipment or a bad review, but the people and forces orbiting the group, any show could turn out to be the last. Chapter 5. RBRM. When New Edition erased itself. After years of relative quiet, it wasn't a fight or a gunshot that brought New Edition's deepest fractures into public view. It was a picture. In late 2018, a promotional image appeared online. 4 men: Ronnie DeVoe, Bobby Brown, Ricky Bell, and Michael Bivens. Underneath the photo was a new name, RBREM. Ralph Tresvant was not there. Johnny Gill was not there. No explanation, no joint statement, just a clean, abrupt split. For industry observers and longtime fans, the shock was immediate. New Edition had broken up, reformed, and reorganized before. But this felt different. Ralph was the voice at the center of their biggest records. Johnny had stepped in and stabilized the group after Bobby's departure. Removing them was not a minor lineup tweak. It was a rejection of their place in the story. Behind that image were long simmering disputes over who had the right to use the New Edition name, who controlled performance credits, and how the group's legacy should be managed. For months, Anger built through unanswered calls, ignored messages and meetings that never happened. Instead of reaching a hard but honest agreement, the four moved ahead on their own. RBRM was rolled out as a done deal. Ronnie would later admit that the very moment that picture went live, a line was crossed. No one had paused to think carefully about how Ralph or Johnny would feel. No one considered what it would mean to fans who had supported every version of the group for decades. It wasn't a carefully thought-out business strategy. It was a raw, emotional move, frustration finally pushed into public. At the first RBRM shows in 2019, Ronnie felt the difference as soon as he stepped on stage. The crowd still clapped, still held up phones, still sang along to certain songs. But there was a gap in the room he could not ignore. Some fans recorded but didn't sing. Others shouted Ralph's name or asked where Johnny was. Ronnie realized this was no longer just a concert. It was a live argument with their own history. Backstage, he recognized a familiar pattern. Years ago, they had stayed quiet under predatory contract. Later, they had kept silent while violence and drugs infected their circle. Now they were using their own influence to erase two key members from the visual representation of New Edition. Ronnie has called it the biggest mistake of his life because this time no one forced them. There was no producer manipulating papers, no hidden trust fund, no powerful label twisting their arms. This was their choice. Looking back over the chain of events, Ronnie arrived at a conclusion that hurt to say out loud. Bobby Brown did not destroy New Edition by himself. Bobby was simply the most visible extreme symptom. What really broke them was the system that began forming when they were still kids in Orchard Park, a system that allowed exploitation, rewarded silence, tolerated violence, and eventually turned private wounds into public humiliation. New Edition did not implode in one dramatic night. They cracked slowly, piece by piece, through every compromise made out of fear, every ego-driven decision, every moment when someone should have said stop and didn't. And the question that still hangs over everything is the one Ronnie cannot fully answer. If New Edition had been treated fairly from the beginning, paid what they were owed, protected as children, instead of used as assets, would the tragedy have been avoided? Or would the same pressures, the same fame, the same unresolved pain have led them down another road toward self-destruction, slower maybe, but just as brutal? If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the